Hi, I'm Lenora, and the first thing you should know is my parents didn't lose me. They left me. At 3 years old, I waited by a window that never opened again. For 20 years, I told myself there must have been a reason, a mistake, something human. But when I finally found them, they looked me in the eyes and said, "You must be one of the charity girls." So I smiled and played along. Let them believe I was broke, naive, powerless. But what they didn't know was that the girl they abandoned now owned a $49 million company. And what happened when I walked through their door wasn't a reunion. It was a test, and they failed spectacularly. Before we dive in, tell me, have you ever been erased by your own blood? Because this is not just a story about being lost. It's about finally realizing, I was never what they wanted, but I became everything they could never control. I'm a woman in my 40s now. I live a quiet, stable life in Oregon. I drink my coffee black, rise before the sun, and make my bed every single morning. Routine has always been my anchor. People who meet me say I'm composed. Put together, they call it. They don't know the reason why I cling so tightly to structure, or why I avoid questions about my childhood. I built everything from the ground up. Discipline, work ethic, a sense of control. Not luck, not inheritance, and definitely not love. A week ago, I stood outside a modest one-story house on Maple Ridge Lane. Nothing fancy, just an aging beige home with overgrown hedges and a cracked walkway. The kind of place you'd drive past without noticing. It had taken me 20 years to find it, or maybe 20 years to be ready to face it. I didn't come with grand expectations. I didn't want apologies or explanations. I just wanted to look them in the eye and see who they were now. I didn't pull up in a Lexus. I rented an older Toyota. I wore jeans and an old navy sweater, hair tied back, no makeup. Nothing about me screamed wealth or power, on purpose. I needed them to see me the way they saw everyone else. Because I needed to know, if they thought I was nothing, would they still pretend to care? I stood at the door for a moment longer than I should have. My hand hovered near the bell. Then I knocked, once, then twice. I could hear footsteps inside, someone pausing, maybe checking the peephole. The delay was longer than I expected. The door cracked open, just a sliver. A woman stood behind it, early 60s, faded blonde hair, tired eyes. Her mouth was tight. She didn't smile. She looked at me like I was a solicitor. "Yes? I think I'm at the right address," I said, soft but steady. "Is this the Jones residence?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked down at my shoes, my jacket. She opened the door a few inches wider. "I'm sorry, who are you?" I felt the air shift, cold and detached. No flicker of recognition, no urgency, just caution and a hint of annoyance. "I'm Lenora," I said. Still nothing. I waited. Finally, she stepped aside. "Well, come in then." Inside, the house smelled like reheated food and old candles. Not unpleasant, just lived in. The kind of space that hadn't changed much in 20 years. I stepped in and, almost instinctively, slid off my shoes and placed them neatly against the wall. No one asked me to, but I couldn't bring myself to track anything into their space. It wasn't my home. I knew that without anyone saying it. There was a man sitting on the couch, flipping through a TV guide. He glanced up, gave me a polite nod, and went back to his page. Not a trace of shock. Not even curiosity. "We weren't expecting company," the woman said, walking ahead of me into the living room. "You'll have to excuse the mess." There was no mess. I sat where she gestured, an armchair with worn fabric. The kind you sink into and disappear a little. "So, what brings you here?" she asked, folding her arms. "You from around here?" "No, not exactly." She nodded slowly. Passing through? I offered a small smile. Something like that. She looked at my jeans. You working? Yes, I said. Careful. I do some consulting. Odd jobs. Oh. She glanced at the man, who was still thumbing the TV guide like it held all the answers in the world. Tough economy for that kind of thing. I nodded. It can be. You live alone? I do. She clucked her tongue. Brave girl. It's hard managing on your own. Rent's outrageous. I get by. That's when I saw it in her eyes. The assumption had already been made. I was struggling, modest, grateful just to be sitting there. They'd labeled me without realizing, or maybe they had. I was the poor girl passing through, probably looking for a favor. Not once had they asked why I looked familiar. Not once had they asked if we'd met before. And in that moment, I made a choice. I wouldn't tell them, not yet. I wanted to see, really see, how they treated someone they didn't recognize, someone they assumed had nothing to offer. I leaned back slightly, took in the space, the framed photos, none of which included me, the placement of chairs, where they sat and where I'd been placed, away from the center, by the window like an afterthought. And I wondered, quietly, if they think I'm poor, what do they think I deserve? They seated me at the edge of the table, close enough to hear everything, far enough to matter to no one. The dining room hadn't changed. Same chipped corners on the table legs, same dull light bulb casting a yellow glow overhead. The kind of lighting that made everyone's face look a little older, a little more tired. The chairs didn't match, but the seats with cushions, those were already taken. I was guided to the one near the wall, a seat with no arms, no padding, and the least amount of conversation floating in its direction. There was no obvious malice in the way people sat. That's what made it worse. It was subtle, automatic, like this seating arrangement had always existed, and I just happened to fit the empty spot that required the least thought. Across from me sat a woman named Carol. I remembered her vaguely from photos, but she didn't seem to remember me at all. Or if she did, she wasn't letting on. She leaned in to chat with the man next to her, some cousin or in-law I couldn't place. They laughed softly about a neighbor's divorce, passing bowls of food around me like I was a piece of furniture. I reached for the green beans, but the bowl shifted down the table before my hand got there. Someone else took them, then passed them to someone else. I let my hand fall back into my lap. It wasn't the food I wanted. I just wanted to be seen. So, what do you do again? Someone asked. The voice came from Mark, the same cousin who didn't recognize me earlier. He was chewing with his mouth slightly open, not bothering to look up as he spoke. I work with small businesses, consulting mostly, I answered. Oh, he said, dragging out the syllable like it had weight. That must be manageable. Someone across the table chuckled. Then another followed, like a wave triggered by obligation rather than humor. Manageable, Carol repeated, grinning as if the word was clever. I smiled back, not because it was funny, but because that's what you do when people want to believe they're being charming, not condescending. I didn't correct them, not because I couldn't, but because I wanted to see where this would go. It wasn't about pride, it was about clarity. I needed to know how deep their assumptions ran. I needed to understand how people behaved when they thought there was no reason to pretend, no status to respect, no image to uphold. The silence I kept was deliberate. Silence has a shape. It can wrap around a room like fog, letting you hear the words people don't say out loud. It can catch the raised eyebrow, the too long pause, the way someone avoids eye contact right after speaking. Must be hard, Carol said, pouring herself another glass of wine. Working on your own like that. I mean, I tried selling candles online once and I just couldn't keep up. Took me hours just to figure out the website. It's not too bad, I said. "You get used to the rhythm." She nodded, slowly. "Well, I guess it suits certain lifestyles." And there it was, certain lifestyles, meaning mine. I took a bite of mashed potatoes, lukewarm, probably made from a box. Someone laughed at the far end of the table. It was loud, an inside joke I wasn't inside of. As if to drive the point home, another question floated over the rolls and salad. "You renting, or do you have a little place of your own?" The phrasing made it sound like owning anything decent would be too far-fetched to consider. "A small place," I replied evenly. "That's smart," said Mark. "I mean, no point in overreaching, right? Especially these days." I looked down at my plate. I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt watched. And the kind of watched that says, "We already decided what your life looks like. We're just waiting for you to confirm it." Then came the kicker. Someone, maybe Aunt Jean, said, "Well, it's nice that you made the effort to come. Not everyone in your position would." My position? I wanted to ask what that meant, but I didn't, because I already knew. They thought I was struggling, alone, drifting, and any sign of stability was treated like a miracle, not a possibility, as if I were surviving rather than living. There was a pause while dishes were passed. I sat quietly, letting the noise of silverware against porcelain fill the space. That's when Uncle Ray, who hadn't said much all evening, leaned in and explained, unprompted, how mortgage rates work, step by step, like he was doing me a favor. "I mean, if you ever do get serious about buying, you want to lock in a rate early," he said. "Don't wait for prices to drop. That's a rookie mistake." I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek. He meant well. That's what made it worse. Everyone in that room was playing a part, and mine was clear. I was the grateful guest, the one they could feel generous toward, without ever asking too much about why I was there, or what I remembered. "Would you like more bread?" someone asked. "No, thank you." "You sure? There's plenty." "I'm fine." "Well," Carol said, pushing the basket closer anyway. "Just take it. You never know when you'll need the energy." It sounded playful. It was not. The conversation shifted again, this time toward politics, a neighbor's dog, a broken fence. I stayed quiet, chewing slowly, listening to them talk about their problems like they were universal truths, as if no one in the world struggled harder than they did to find a reliable plumber or decide where to vacation this fall. Near the end of dinner, someone said, "Say thank you before you go, for the food. It's just polite." It wasn't rude, but it wasn't kind either. Gratitude, I realized, wasn't something I was allowed to feel naturally. It was something expected, taught, imposed. Because I'd been given something, therefore I should act accordingly. Appreciation was the currency, but not mutual, one-sided, a reminder of where they believed I stood. After dessert, store-bought pie thawed a bit too late, people began clearing plates and retreating into small talk and armchairs. I sat for a moment longer, taking in the whole room. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about leverage, perception. Who had the right to sit at the center of the table, and who didn't? I was still playing my part, letting them show me who they really were. Then, as I stood to help clear the table, Aunt Jean said with a nostalgic little laugh, "You must have been such a quiet child. So easy to forget you were even there." Someone else chuckled in agreement. I smiled, but something shifted, because I remembered something they didn't. I stayed quiet for a few minutes after that comment at the table. I cleared a few plates, rinsed my hands at the sink, let the noise of running water steady me. I didn't leave the room, though. I just shifted slightly to the side, close enough to hear conversations overlap. That's when the memory surfaced, uninvited, the way it always does when people speak too casually about things they never lived through. I was 3 years old the last time I heard my name spoken with urgency. Not shouted, not scolded. Just called, sharp and quick, the way you call a child when something isn't right. I remember the sound more than the words, the pitch of it, the sudden change in tone. I remember light spilling across a concrete floor and the smell of something metallic, maybe a shopping cart or a railing I held onto because it felt solid. I don't remember wandering off. What I remember is standing still while the world kept moving. Adults walked past me, shoes scraped, a door closed somewhere. I remember thinking that if I stayed quiet, someone would come back. That waiting felt safer than crying. Crying took energy. Waiting felt smarter. Time didn't exist the way it does now. There was only before and after. Before someone let go of my hand. After I realized it wasn't coming back. No one was searching in that moment. Not near me. Not where I stood. I wasn't hidden. I wasn't lost behind anything. I was simply unnoticed. That part never made it into the story they told. Growing up, I heard a version of that day repeated in fragments, always told by someone else, always with confidence. You wandered off. You were curious. You were difficult. We looked everywhere. Children do that sometimes. It was a neat story. Simple. Painless. A story where no one failed. Standing in that kitchen decades later, I heard it again. Same words. Same calm certainty. Someone laughed softly as they said it, like it was a harmless family anecdote. You always were a runner, someone said. Never stayed put. I felt my shoulders stiffen. No one asked if that was true. No one looked at me to check. The story didn't need confirmation. It had been rehearsed long enough to feel real. I understood something then that took me years to accept. Whoever controls the story controls the weight of it. If I wandered, then losing me was an accident. If I waited, then leaving me behind becomes something else entirely. Correcting them would mean unraveling more than a memory. It would mean forcing people to sit with questions they'd avoided their whole lives. Questions about responsibility, about attention, about how easy it is to forget a child who learns early not to ask for space. I didn't have the strength for that, not yet. Silence had been my shelter for a long time. Silence kept me from becoming the problem, from being labeled sensitive or dramatic. Silence let me survive, but survival leaves marks. As they talked, I watched my hands rest flat on the horizar counter, still steady, still capable. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't small. I just felt tired in a very specific way. The kind of fatigue that comes from carrying the same truth alone for too long. Then I noticed it. Across the room, someone paused mid-sentence. An older woman, sitting near the window. I hadn't paid much attention to her earlier. She didn't smile, she didn't frown, she just looked at me. Not with curiosity, not with pity, recognition. It was brief, a second at most, but it landed heavier than anything said out loud, as if she saw the gap between the story and the person standing there, as if she knew not to interrupt, but also knew not to look away. It didn't fix anything, it didn't undo the past, but for that moment I wasn't invisible. The conversation drifted again. Someone refilled a glass. Someone else mentioned how fortunate I was to reconnect, how lucky it must feel to be welcomed back like this. Lucky. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. I smiled politely, the way you do when you understand the expectation behind the compliment. Gratitude was being offered, but only if I accepted the terms that came with it. I nodded, because that's what they wanted. Inside, something shifted. They called it a blessing, but it felt like another condition. The word grateful followed me into the next morning like a warning. I woke before anyone else. Or maybe they were already awake and just didn't care enough to show it. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. I moved slowly, aware of every creak in the floorboards, like I was walking through someone else's memory. I didn't know if I was allowed in the kitchen or just assuming I could be. I paused in the hallway, fingers brushing the frame of the doorway, waiting for some cue that never came. The same way I used to wait as a child, not for permission, just not wanting to be in the way. When I finally stepped in, the air was warm with the smell of toast and weak coffee. My aunt, she always insisted on being called that, not by name, was already there, dressed like she'd been up for hours. She didn't greet me, just handed me a cup like I'd been expected. "Hope you slept okay," she said, not looking at me. "This place gets drafty. You're lucky we had that extra room. Most people wouldn't." I nodded, murmured a thank you I didn't really mean. I hadn't asked for the room. I hadn't asked for any of it. That was the tone of the morning. Every act of routine, offering breakfast, setting down a plate, asking if I needed anything, carried a soft edge. None of it cruel, all of it calculated. It wasn't kindness, it was control dressed in warmth. Over toast, someone else drifted in. My cousin Brian, who still lived 2 blocks away, and treated every family event like it was his stage. He poured himself coffee, sat at the head of the table like he'd earned it, and looked over at me with that same amused detachment I remembered from years ago. "You're still out west, right?" he asked. "Must be tough out there. How do you survive?" I smiled, keeping my eyes on the mug in my hands. "I manage." "Yeah," he said, like it confirmed something. "It's different for folks who didn't stick close to home. Out there, it's just every man for himself, I guess." Then came the chuckle, the kind that invited others to laugh without needing a joke. I looked around the table. No one corrected him. No one said a word. That silence spoke volumes. They weren't curious. They were satisfied. The assumption wasn't an error. It was the point. Later, my aunt offered advice I hadn't asked for. "You know, if you need anything, just say the word. Some folks are too proud, but around here, we take care of our own." I thanked her again, the way you do when you know that help would come with strings you couldn't cut later. That morning taught me something I'd only felt in pieces before. Gratitude in this family was a form of silence. To be grateful was to be quiet, to smile, to never ask why the story was always told from one side. The more thankful you acted, the more comfortable everyone else stayed. I swallowed it. Again. I wasn't going to challenge them, not yet. Because I was learning something important. Their comfort depended on me saying nothing. And if that was true, then silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Still, it wore me down. There was a moment, later that day, when I nearly broke that rule. I was helping in the dining room, folding napkins that didn't need folding, just to look useful. I heard them talking in the kitchen, my uncle and Brian, something about finances, about the house. My name came up, quietly. "She should be grateful we even let her in," someone said. "She's not entitled to anything." And just like that, it clicked. This wasn't just about the past. This wasn't about family reunion or healing or moving on. There were decisions being made, conversations I wasn't part of, plans that were already unfolding. I stepped closer to the doorway. I didn't speak. I didn't move. That's when I saw it, on the kitchen table half covered by a newspaper. A manila folder with notes, names, and something that looked like a legal header. The conversation stopped when they noticed me. My uncle smiled too quickly. "We're just going over boring paperwork. Nothing for you to worry about." And just like that, I knew. They weren't forgetting me. They were deciding without me. The first time I saw the paperwork, my name wasn't there. It was late afternoon, the kind of time when the sun casts long shadows across the carpet, and everything looks quieter than it feels. I wasn't looking for anything, not exactly. I was just moving through the house, slowly, like I didn't belong to the air in it. On the kitchen table, under a neat stack of placemats, and beside a half-empty bottle of multivitamins, sat the folder. Cream-colored, thick, no label. A corner had curled up from being opened and closed too many times. I don't know what made me pause. Maybe it was the way they hushed when I walked in that morning. Maybe it was the folder itself. Something about it said, "Not for you," without needing words. I didn't touch it at first, I just looked. The top page was a spreadsheet of some kind. Names were printed in bold, columns for roles, responsibilities, maybe shares, though I couldn't see the headers clearly. It wasn't the kind of paper people leave out by accident. My eyes scanned down the page. James, Linda, Brian, Uncle Ray. Even Diane, who'd only been married 5 years ago, and still talked about the family like it was an organization she joined. I kept reading. My name wasn't on it. There was no space where it had been scratched out, no sign it had ever been there. I stood there for a moment, holding my breath like I might see better that way. Then I turned around slowly, half expecting someone to jump in and explain it. But no one came. No one said a word. When I sat at the table later for dinner, it wasn't mentioned. But I could feel it in the air, the same way humidity wraps around your skin before a storm breaks. My fork scraped too loudly against the plate. My water glass stayed too full. Conversations moved around me like rivers parting for a rock. That's when I started noticing the pauses. Each time I walked into a room, they stopped talking. Each time I asked something simple. "What are you all working on?" Or, "Need help with that?" They smiled too wide, offered vague answers. "Oh, just family stuff. We're trying to get all this sorted out. Nothing big." But their tone told the truth. It was big, and I wasn't part of it. The thing about exclusion is, it doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's a polite nod, a shift in tone, a door left half open, and sometimes it's your name missing from the page. That night, I sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at the blue floral pattern of the quilt. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much at all. Just a steady, growing coldness at the center of my chest. I started to wonder if maybe this was always the plan. Maybe I was never meant to be written in. I thought of the stories I'd heard about myself. You wandered off. You were always a little distant. You never really bonded. The narratives that made it easier to keep me on the edge of things. And I realized how neat it was for them to believe those stories. Because if I was always distant, always unreliable, then they never had to feel guilty for leaving me out. It made sense. The paperwork didn't forget me. It erased me, on purpose. I started to reach for my suitcase. It was still tucked beneath the bed, only halfway unpacked. Part of me never intended to stay long. I thought about slipping out the door, getting in the rental car, and driving away. No note, no scene, just leave the way I had before. I could be back on the highway in 10 minutes. They'd probably say, "Well, we knew she wouldn't last." I even put my hand on the handle. But then I saw it, folded in the side pocket, tucked beneath a sweater I hadn't worn in years. A drawing. Faded crayon lines on printer paper. It was a house with flowers in the yard and a crooked blue sky. And in the corner, a stick figure labeled "Me." Next to it, 2 others, Mom and Dad. I had drawn it when I was 5 in a foster home. One of the women had kept it in a file and mailed it to me years later. I don't know why I'd packed it. Maybe I needed to remember that even when people forget you, you can still draw yourself in. I sat back down. I didn't leave, not because I wanted to stay, because I wanted to see it through. The next morning, I was quieter, not out of fear, but calculation. I stopped asking questions. I stopped volunteering to help. I moved through the house like wallpaper, present, silent, watching. That's when I started seeing it more clearly. They spoke in code. We want things to stay in the family. Only the ones who've always been here. It's not personal. It's just practical. And when they said things like, "We've already figured most of it out," it wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to be final. They didn't need me to agree. They needed me to accept. That afternoon, I passed by the kitchen and heard them talking again. Brian's voice, flat and certain. "She'll be fine. She's used to getting by on her own." That was the moment I understood they didn't just underestimate me. They dismissed me. Being dismissed hurts more than being hated. At least with hatred, you're still seen. I moved through the hallway, slower than I needed to, listening. Not eavesdropping, just not rushing to interrupt what was already meant to exclude me. I wasn't hiding. I didn't need to. They talked like I wasn't there whether I stood in the doorway or 10 feet away. They were in the kitchen. I stayed just past the arch, close enough to hear every word. "She's always been a little unpredictable," Linda said, scraping something into the trash bin. Her voice was light, like she was recalling the weather. "We have to think long-term here." "Exactly," Brian chimed in. "It's not about her feelings. It's about what makes sense." "And she'll understand," someone else added. I think it was Diane. Her voice dipped in that saccharine concern that always tastes more like vinegar. "She should be grateful we've kept her in the loop this far." They laughed. Not mean, just casual, and that's what cut the deepest. Because it wasn't a joke to me. It was my life they were folding into convenience. I stepped into the room slowly, quiet but deliberate. None of them noticed. Not really. Brian glanced at me and kept chewing. Diane offered a distant smile and returned to wiping the counter. No one paused. No one said, "Lenora, what do you think?" They just continued. Linda poured herself a glass of water and said, without even glancing my way, "She's always had trouble holding things down. We've done what we could." My body stiffened. I was 5 feet from her, not down the hall, not behind a wall, right there. And still, I was reduced to a case study. Something to speak about, not to. It wasn't new, but somehow that made it worse. I looked at the fridge. A picture of their vacation to Oregon was held up by a magnet shaped like a duck. Everyone was smiling. Even the dog had a scarf. I wasn't in that photo. Of course I wasn't. They were curating the family they wanted. I stood still, silent, until Linda brushed past me with her water. She didn't make eye contact, but I did. That's when I spoke. "Who made the decision?" The sentence was soft, but it sliced the air. The room stilled. The clock ticked louder. Brian set his coffee mug down like it weighed too much. No one answered. So I asked again. "My name was left out. I want to know who decided that." I didn't yell. I didn't shake. I spoke the way you do when the storm is already inside you and there's nothing left to brace against. Brian cleared his throat. "Lenora, let's not turn this into..." "Into what?" I cut in. "Into something uncomfortable for you? It already is." Linda's smile tightened. "We just assumed you'd prefer not to be involved in the legal details. You've always been more free-spirited." I blinked slowly. That word, free-spirited. They used it when they didn't want to say unreliable, unstable, out of place. "You didn't ask me," I said flatly. "You decided for me." Diane stepped in with her peacemaker voice. "It's not malicious. You've been gone a long time. We just didn't know where you stood." I nodded once. "You knew where to find me when you needed help covering funeral costs. You knew how to reach me when you needed someone to sign off on the sale of the old house. You knew I existed when I was useful." Brian's jaw twitched. "We're not trying to fight." "I'm not fighting," I said. "I'm drawing a line." That was the moment everything changed. Not loudly, not with screaming or broken dishes. But the air in that room shifted like a storm front rolling in slow. I saw it in their faces: annoyance, discomfort, calculation. They didn't like this version of me. They liked me better quiet, agreeable, accepting. Linda chuckled once. This feels like an overreaction. And there it was. The trapdoor they always used when someone called them out. Frame it as an emotional overreach. Make it about tone, not truth. I didn't flinch. I'm letting you know now. If you keep making choices for me, don't be surprised when I make some for myself. Ones you don't like. I walked out before they could answer. Not stormed, walked. Every step deliberate, like I was folding back into myself for something more important. In the hallway, I passed the mirror. I looked different. Not better, not worse. Just returned. As if some piece that had been sitting quietly inside me stood up at last. In the guest room, I sat down on the bed, pulled out my notebook, and started listing things. Not plans, not revenge, just facts. Who said what? Who stayed silent? Who pretended to care? I stopped hoping for fairness. That was the last piece of me they got. Evening fell in gradients of gold and gray. I walked out back just as the porch light flickered on. The chill in the air was sharp enough to keep me alert. I sat on the steps listening to voices trickle through the open kitchen window. They weren't talking about me this time. They were planning. She could make this messy if she pushes it, Brian said. She doesn't have the resources, Diane replied. And if she starts anything, we just explain her history. People will understand. Linda added, almost too casually, she's always had a reputation. And that was it. The next line they were willing to cross. They weren't just cutting me out. They were preparing a story to explain why it was right to do so. They thought silence meant surrender, and that mistake would cost them everything. Silence was never my weakness. It was my weapon. But they mistook it for surrender, and that miscalculation shifted everything. That night, after the kitchen confrontation, I didn't sleep. The house was too quiet in that way that meant something was moving behind walls. Every creak of the floorboard, every soft click of a closing door, felt like a whisper meant to stay hidden. I stayed in my room, light off, listening. The shift didn't come with yelling or slamming doors. It came in omission. The next morning, no one knocked. No one asked if I was coming down for breakfast. I walked into the kitchen around 7:30. The coffee was already brewed. Plates were being rinsed. Conversations stopped as I entered. Smiles pulled tight like plastic wrap. Brian nodded toward the fridge like a clerk pointing at a vending machine. There's food if you want some. That was it. No warmth, no how'd you sleep, no place set for me. I sat anyway, quiet, observing. They made a show of being cordial, but I'd lived long enough to recognize the moment a room becomes a stage and I become the scene they want to hurry past. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside to breathe. I needed air that hadn't been filtered through rehearsed civility. The backyard was still damp from the night, the grass soft under my shoes. I stood there, arms folded, listening to the birds. That's when I heard Linda's voice inside, just loud enough through the screen door. I'm just saying, we don't know what she wants. People like her. They stir things up. People like her. I backed up slowly, heart thudding. People like me meant unpredictable, meant unstable, meant dangerous if provoked. I'd heard that tone before. From doctors when I was younger, from counselors who thought my silence was a symptom. Back inside, the energy was worse. Conversations slid around me like I wasn't part of the room. No one asked my opinion anymore. Even the way they walked past me had changed. Shoulders tight, eyes averted, as if I'd become contagious. After lunch, I overheard the first lie. She asked about the insurance, Diane said on the phone. She was in the hallway. I was in the laundry room, folding a towel that didn't belong to me. I don't know, it felt strategic. like she's here for something. I froze. I never asked about the insurance, not once. I'd barely looked at the paperwork. I didn't even know where they kept it. That lie wasn't an accident. It was a foundation. From there, it spread. Linda spoke in hushed tones to someone I didn't recognize on a call. She's struggling, you can tell. I mean, she tries to appear strong, but the cracks are there. Brian told someone at the front door I was still adjusting and probably a little overwhelmed. Each word was a thread, carefully pulled to unravel me without ever raising a voice. They weren't attacking me directly. They were building a version of me that could be dismissed, pitied, excluded, and worse, they were doing it with ease, with confidence, like they'd done this before. That night, I was left out of dinner entirely. I came downstairs and found an empty table, no plate, no invitation, just leftovers sealed in foil with my name on a sticky note. The note felt more like a warning than a kindness. I sat in the dark near the back window, eating cold chicken and potatoes while their laughter echoed from the living room. I didn't cry. I chewed slowly, swallowing each bite with a kind of steel-edged focus that comes when you know you're being pushed to break. Then came the real blow. Linda pulled me aside late that evening, her voice soft, low. I need to ask, did you tell anyone about what Brian said last year? About the estate? I blinked. No. She tilted her head, squinting. Because someone mentioned something, it's probably nothing, but if it gets out, it could complicate things legally. I stared at her. I didn't know what she was talking about. And that's when I realized they were creating a paper trail, preemptively justifying whatever came next. The next morning, I found a printed copy of an email on the kitchen counter, no envelope, just sitting there, as if accidentally left out. It was a message between Brian and a lawyer, referencing my emotional unpredictability and unresolved mental health matters. I hadn't seen a therapist in years. I hadn't needed one. But they were rewriting my history, using old facts and distorting them just enough to make a case. For what? I didn't know yet. But I could feel the trap forming. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing my bag in silence and walking out the front door without saying a word. Let them have the story. Let them spin the ending they wanted. But I didn't move, because something inside me, something older than anger, said, not yet. I thought of being 3 again, standing alone in that store, shelves too tall to see over, voices too far to reach. That feeling was back, that same breathless panic of being left behind on purpose. But this time, I wasn't 3, and I wasn't alone. I had my mind, I had my memory, and I had a plan. I stopped speaking unless it mattered. I took notes in my journal, quietly, constantly. I made phone calls from the backyard, not the kitchen. I stopped hoping they'd see me and started preparing for them to regret ignoring me. Their next move came late. I was walking upstairs when I heard Brian on the phone. She's not in the will. It's already been filed. There's nothing for her to contest. His voice was calm, cold, and that was it. That was the line. They hadn't just erased me from the conversation. They'd erased me from the legacy. That was the moment I stopped trying to survive. And decided to end this. Ending, it didn't mean violence. It meant truth, delivered at the worst possible time. The following afternoon, the house felt scrubbed and curated. Like a stage set for a performance, nobody rehearsed with me. The dining room table was extended. Crystal glasses sparkled. Polished silverware lined up like soldiers. They'd invited extended family under the guise of a casual gathering, but nothing about the air was casual. I recognized the tone immediately. Performative peace. The kind where people smile too long and talk too loud. The kind that says, everything is fine, when everything is about to burn. I sat near the window. I wasn't offered a chair at the center of the table, but I didn't need one. I wasn't part of their seating chart, but I had planned my own entrance. Linda laughed too hard at something Brian said. Diane passed out drinks, with her lips pressed into a fixed grin. The cousins made small talk, and someone even asked about my drive into town, but they didn't wait for my answer. I stayed quiet. For now. They thought my silence was submission. They thought yesterday's games, the isolation, the half-truths, the legal whispers, had worked. What they didn't know was I wasn't hiding. I was loading the truth like a stone in my hand, waiting for the right moment to let it go. Brian stood. We're just so grateful everyone could be here. It's not often we all get to slow down and appreciate family. He looked around the table. Everyone nodded. Someone even clapped. I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I knew what was coming. He continued, and I know it's been a transition with Lenora being back. He gestured vaguely toward me. But we're trying to support her as best we can. Support, that word again, as if I was a project, not a person. Still, I didn't speak. I let him paint his version of events. Linda jumped in, her voice syrup-sweet. She's had a hard life, and we all have big hearts, right? She laughed, inviting others to join. They did. I let the laughter hang. Then I stood, slowly, calmly. I'd like to clarify one thing, I said. The room quieted. Every fork froze. Every eye turned. My voice didn't waver. I appreciate your concern, I really do. But it seems there's been a misunderstanding about who I am and why I'm here. Linda opened her mouth. I raised a hand gently. Just 1 minute. That's all I'll take. I turned toward the window, then back. I've listened to your stories. I've heard the whispers, the suggestions that I came back out of desperation, that I'm confused or unstable. No one spoke. And I get it. That version of me is easier to manage, easier to dismiss. I paused. I let you hold on to that version because I wanted to see how far you'd go with it. A beat of silence. Then I dropped it. I'm not unemployed. I'm not lost. And I'm not someone you need to feel sorry for. I reached into my bag, pulled out a single folded sheet, laid it flat on the table. This is the deed to the property you assumed I was trying to get a piece of. Murmurs, shuffling. My name's already on it, has been for over a year. Signed by Aunt May herself. Witnessed, filed. Linda's hand twitched toward the paper. She stopped herself. I continued. What I didn't mention is, I was the one who took care of her. Quietly, remotely. I paid for the in-home nurse the final 6 months. I managed her accounts. I honored her request to keep it private. I didn't boast. I didn't raise my voice. I just told the truth. I didn't come back to take anything. I came because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd remember who I really was. Someone gasped softly. Diane. Brian said, Wait, that can't be. It is, I said, not looking at him. And I didn't need to prove it, until now. I folded the paper and tucked it back in my bag. No one moved. I won't stay long, but I needed you to hear this while you still thought you were winning. I let the silence stretch, because that silence now belonged to me. Someone whispered, She's telling the truth. I turned to Linda. You spent so much time building a version of me that made you feel better, more generous, more powerful. Then I looked at each face. I let you believe it. That was my mistake. No one looked me in the eye anymore. I walked toward the doorway, stopping just short. I came here for closure. I stayed to see who you really were. And I'm leaving with the only thing you never expected me to have, the truth. One more breath. I don't need your apology. I don't want your approval. I only wanted one thing. They waited. To remind you that I was never the problem, Just the proof of yours. I didn't wait for a reply. I stood up straighter, picked up my bag, and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. Not this time. I walked out knowing the truth had already done its damage. Damage doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like silence finally breaking. The screen door clicked softly behind me as I stepped off the porch. I didn't turn back, not once. I didn't need to. The house looked smaller from the street, like it had folded in on itself. Everything they built to feel so important, the hierarchy, the performance, shrank the farther I walked. I didn't rush, just moved toward my car with the kind of quiet you earn after days of being erased and choosing not to disappear. The engine hummed to life. I drove slowly down that old gravel driveway, windows down, late light brushing across the dashboard like forgiveness. I let the air hit my face. No music, no phone calls, just the sound of gravel crunching, heart settling. Freedom didn't come with a cheer. It came in the form of not needing to explain myself anymore. By the time I got back to the apartment I was renting temporarily in town, the sky had gone from golden to soft gray. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding onto the countertop, just breathing. I was tired, bone tired, but the ache wasn't heavy like before. This time, it didn't pull me under. It let me rest. Over the next few days, I didn't reach out. I didn't check social media. I didn't scan for updates. I let the quiet sit. And then, slowly, the consequences began to arrive, not through drama or shouting, but in small, unmistakable shifts. A mutual friend called. "Hey, did you really own part of the property?" I didn't answer right away. I just said, "Yeah." Another message came from an old neighbor, asking if I'd be open to talking to a local paper about Aunt May's community work. They'd heard I'd been managing her care from afar, quietly, without fanfare. The story was spreading, and I wasn't the one telling it. I got a call from a lawyer, not mine, theirs. Just a polite follow-up about clarifying some past assumptions regarding the estate. I kept my voice neutral, offered no emotion, just facts. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to celebrate, just a course correction. The truth, untangled from their fiction, finally moving on its own. One afternoon, Linda sent a message. Just a few lines, carefully worded. "We didn't know everything. I think maybe we misunderstood. Maybe we can talk." I read it once, then deleted it. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. They weren't reaching out because they saw me. They were reaching out because their version of the story no longer held weight. That wasn't a reunion, that was damage control. I didn't need it. I didn't need them. What I had needed for so long was acknowledgement. Not even approval. Just someone to look me in the eye and say, "You were always more than the version we needed you to be." But I stopped needing that too. What I found instead was something steadier. The kind of closure that doesn't come from doors opening, but from knowing you've already walked out. I went back to work the following week, sat down in my small, clean office, opened my laptop. My clients, the ones who knew me for what I'd built, what I'd carried, kept calling. Work didn't stop. Life didn't collapse. I didn't need to explain anything. I was still here, still whole. Late one evening, I pulled a drawer open and found it, a small folded note card from Aunt May. It had come with a plant she sent me 2 years ago when I moved to a new city. I hadn't looked at it since. Her handwriting was careful. "Root where you are. They don't have to see it to know it grows." I read it 3 times. That line, once painful, now felt like proof. I had rooted, quietly, strongly, and nothing they did had pulled me out. I held the card against my chest and sat for a long time. Family, what a word. For so long, I thought it was supposed to be given. That blood meant belonging. That if I did enough, proved enough, stayed long enough, I'd be seen. But that was never the truth. Family wasn't built on obligation or performance. It was built on choice, on care, on consistency. And I had been choosing them for years. While they had chosen the version of me that made them comfortable, I didn't hate them. That surprised me. I just didn't need to belong there anymore. I had made a life, one with weight and shape. And every step I took away from their approval was one step back to myself. I didn't lose my family that day. I finally stopped losing myself.